Okay, hello everyone. And if you're coming here as the second part of our learning series on government budget, welcome back. If you haven't seen our first series, please go and look to see if you can listen to the first series as a basic primer before we start getting into this discussion. I'm sure the link will be provided for you. I'm Kalbert Young. I'm the current Vice President for Budget and Finance and the University of Hawaiʻi Systems Chief Financial Officer. And I'm presenting this presentation to you as an opportunity to learn more about the basic fundamentals of government budgeting and as it relates to the University of Hawaiʻi. So you can expect to see a lot of state-level terms, ideas, concepts regarding the budget, but you'll also start getting to see very specific items about how that budget looks to the University of Hawaiʻi. Now, I'm recording this video for you in late 2025. So if you are watching it after this point in time, some of the information will be more historical for you. But I would trust that it's still relevant and applicable nonetheless from whenever you are viewing this. So this part of the series, we're going to talk about the operational appropriations or the operating budget appropriation, how that is reflected in the budget, and what you can expect to see as part of the University of Hawaii's budget. Now, I mentioned the earlier series, the first series part. That one kind of talked about all of the general components of the budget and mentioned specifically about the operating portion. And that's what we'll talk about today. So first of all, when we look at the level of funding that the University of Hawaiʻi receives as for its operating budget, there's two big components that fund the university, really just two revenue sources. The first being general funds of the state of Hawaiʻi. So these are monies appropriated by the state legislature from state tax dollars to every department in some fashion. And the University of Hawaiʻi is one of those departments, and we get a fair amount of appropriations of general funds from the legislature to fund the University of Hawaiʻi operations. It represents somewhere in the neighborhood of about 60% of the total operating requirements of the University of Hawaiʻi, less research, so not including research. The other major revenue part of the University of Hawaiʻi is actually from earned revenues, such as tuition. And tuition is the number one source of earned revenues for the University of Hawaiʻi. Here, what you should see on this chart is, over the years, the operating budget of the University of Hawaiʻi has been growing. But if you look at the portion that is funded for that growth from state appropriations, general funds, and the amount from university earned revenues, that amount has largely been consistent for the most part, but also growing. And I would say that the amount of funding that the University of Hawaiʻi receives in public funds from our state is actually a very commendable level. I believe it puts the University of Hawaiʻi system somewhere in the top third, maybe even in the top 10% of all states and all state-funded institutions or systems in the country. Now, for the funding profile of the university, where does most of the appropriations go? Here on this slide, in the most recently completed fiscal year 25, which concluded on June 30th, 2025, here you see the breakdown of how the university program IDs, and if you're asking yourself, what are program IDs? I would also invite you to go back and refer to our series 1, where I explained what program IDs are. But for the program IDs, that is the University of Hawaiʻi, you'll see how that is actually appropriated. And of course, the majority of the appropriation goes to one program ID, that being UH Manoa. It is the largest institution, largest campus, so that makes sense. But you'll also see how much that funding is of the funding that the university gets is distributed between the other campuses, West Oahu, Hilo. And then the programs that are under Manoa that are identified for separate program ID funding. JABSOM, the medical school, and the Cancer Center. Again, these level of fundings are pretty envious to receive that much funding appropriation from the state. When you look at the entire state budget in the current biennium, this is for fiscal year 2026 and for fiscal year 2027, as appropriated at the 2025 legislature, you see a state budget that's roughly about $20.5 billion in total funding from all funding sources of the state. And when you look at the amounts of funding, what should stand out to you is that, again, the number one source of funding for the state is general funds. And that's our tax revenue collections for the state and how that is distributed. It is the number one sought after level of funding for all departments, including the University of Hawaiʻi. There are other sources of funds though, special funds, as I mentioned earlier, the tuition revenues that are collected from the University of Hawaiʻi are part of the Tuition and Fees Special Fund, the TFSF, which is statutorily provided for and authorized. That funding there is also technically appropriated by the state legislature, even though that is monies or funds that are not provided for by the state legislature. They are instead authorized to be expended by the university should the university generate that level of funding. That type of funding is reflected here on this chart as special funds. Let's stay with the state for a little bit and look at just how generous is the state in supporting the University of Hawaiʻi or higher education or public education in general in Hawaii. This graph here shows you for the current biennium how the entire $20.5 billion or so of state tax revenues is distributed across all the different departments. And I would say for the University of Hawaiʻi, we're looking at receiving something on the order of about 7% of the entire state budget is allocated towards the University of Hawaiʻi, compared to about 15% of the entire state budget is funded or directed towards the State Department of Education, our K-12 public system of K-12 schools. So in total, more than 22% of the entire state budget is towards education. I've mentioned earlier that these are enviable levels for a lot of states relative to the size of their budget. But when you look specifically at general funds of the state of Hawaii, only the general fund revenues, the picture is a little bit different. So as I mentioned, general funds is the number one sought after revenue source for all departments. It provides the most flexibility, but it is also the most sought after for legislative appropriations. For the University of Hawaii, if you looked at only general funds in the general fund budget of the state, the portion that is actually provided to the university is much less. It's about 6%. And while still an enviable level of funding, it does represent and signal how much of the state commitment via our tax dollars is actually set to progress to higher education and to the University of Hawaii. Now, what's not included or not overtly obvious in those last two slides is how much funding and support is provided to from the state that is actually not money given to the University of Hawaii directly. And I will point out here, there's three major components that most of us at the University of Hawaii will never realize, most people in the state will never realize, and a lot of legislators even will not realize that the University of Hawaii receives funding support via appropriations that do not come to the University of Hawaiʻi. Instead, they go to the State Department of Budget and Finance, identified specifically for the benefit of components at the University of Hawaiʻi. And the number one cost at the University of Hawaiʻi is labor. Labor accounts for more than 70% of any campus's operations, and our total operating budget at the university is easily more than 70% committed towards labor costs. And in some campuses, it actually might be higher than that. Well, what's not immediately known or familiar for a lot of us is that the money that is appropriated to the university for labor is actually only for salaries. If you are a general funded employee, that meant that you have a general fund authorized position identified in the budget that the legislature authorized. I've spoken previously in our first series about what position ceilings are in the budget, and that's what this is related to, position ceilings. But if you are a general funded authorized position, it is presumed that there was also general funds actually appropriated to pay for your salaries. And in doing so, when the university uses those general funds to pay for your salary, there is a statutory requirement that whatever fund pays your salary must also pay for your fringe benefits. And fringe benefits are the shadow second most expensive operational expenditure at the University of Hawaiʻi, because we don't really see a lot of the costs for fringe benefits. What are fringe benefits, you might be asking? Fringe benefits are those things above our salaries that we all receive as benefits for being University of Hawaiʻi employees or State of Hawaiʻi employees. They include things such as contributions from your employer, the University of Hawaiʻi or the State of Hawaiʻi, towards your pension when you eventually retire. It may also include things such as paying for the portion of your health insurance if you are partaking of health insurance provided by the state. Well, that type of expenditure, if you are general fund authorized, the university actually doesn't pay for that. The State of Hawaiʻi actually pays for it via an appropriation to the State Department of Budget and Finance, here reflected as program ID 748, for example, or 768 for health insurance premiums. So State Budget and Finance takes care of those payments for fringe benefits for general fund authorized position. However, I will point out one important exception. You could be a general fund authorized position, but at the University of Hawaiʻi, it is not uncommon that there are insufficient general funds provided to the university to actually pay your salary. And in those instances, the university will still utilize university funds to pay for your salary, even though you are general fund authorized. But in doing so, the statute that I mentioned earlier, where whatever source of funds pays your salary must pay for your fringe, the university typically will use tuition and fee special funds to pay for salaries. It's the second most used fund source for salaries. So even though you may be general fund authorized, if the university decides to pay for your salary using tuition and fee special fund, we must also use tuition and fee special fund to pay for your fringe. Tuition and fee special funds are not monies provided for by the legislature. They are monies that the university has had to earn. And so when the university pays your salaries with tuition and fee special fund, it also pays your fringe. Technically, you are at a higher cost to the university because those are actually university funds. Now, we also have a lot of positions that are authorized as special funded positions or revolving fund positions. And those positions, because they are authorized by non-general funds, special funds, or revolving funds in the budget bill by the legislature, general funds should not be used to pay for those salaries. So that means that by filling those positions, utilizing those positions within the position ceiling from special funds or revolving fund authorizations, the university is committed that it will pay for fringe. Now, the one thing that a lot of us may not realize too is, how much is fringe? How big of an expense is that? Well, I'll tell you that it is pretty expensive. So in 2025, the current fringe rate on average for all of us, for any of us at the university, is roughly about 53 to 56%. So that means that if you are an employee and your salary is, let's say, $100,000, just for a nice round number, that means the fringe benefits that you get actually are costing the university and or the state to the tune about $53,000 to $56,000 a year as well. So the benefits that we receive, no doubt, are very valuable. And understand from this presentation that the university's commitment and support to fund those benefits and your salaries, how they are reflected in the budget. Now we're going to get into a little bit more of granularity and details. And this slide here, which I've labeled as budget worksheets, if you've made it this far in the presentation, I want you to consider this the hidden cheat code on understanding the budget. And if you can understand this particular slide and look for the treasure jewel that I've identified here, it will immensely advance you and help you stand above all of your colleagues in terms of understanding the state budget or the university budget or even budgets of other departments. The budget worksheets is not the budget. The budget, though, that is approved by the state legislature is a official government document that has the authority that is required by the state constitution of the legislature and the executive branch to identify funding for every single department. But as I've mentioned before, it's at the program ID levels, which are very large and broad and general. When someone asks you, hey, whatever happened to that funding for my 2 Turkish language professors that were appropriated or I thought were appropriated? Where is that in the budget? Most people will say, well, let's go look at the budget bill approved and authorized by the legislature. And you could spend hours looking through a multi-100-page document that is the budget bill, trying to find this or any other appropriation. And I will tell you, it will be futile. You will not find anything to that level of detail anywhere in the budget bill. But you will if you can find the budget worksheets. The budget worksheets are a separate document that is pretty obscure. And unless you've actually done legislative budgeting or legislative processes, you will probably never ever hear anyone talk about the budget worksheets. But the budget worksheets are the cheat code because they include all of the very explicit items that the legislature deliberated on in the budget and chose to fund or not fund. So that's the other thing. When you'll see, I'll show you a sample of a budget, what the budget worksheet looks like, and it will show you a comparison of what did the governor request in the budget and what did the legislature do with that request? Was it a yes? Was it a no? Was it in part? What was some of the reasons that they chose to fund or not fund those items? You get a lot of that jewel of information from the budget worksheets. I hope I've enticed you enough to go out and hunt for this treasure, the budget worksheet, because I will tell you it's not all that easy to find, but it is on the legislature's website. And as of 2025, you can probably get there by when you pull up the budget bill and you look at the conclusion of the legislature, you look for a link that says budget worksheets. There will probably be multiple links One might be the worksheets that looks at what did the House do, the House of Representatives do, when they finished deliberation on the budget. What did the Senate do when they finished looking at the House version of the budget? And then finally, in conference committee, before they passed the budget bill, what was the final decision either way from both the House and the Senate to complete the budget bill? If you can find this budget worksheet and look at it, I guarantee you will find it so much more informative than the actual budget bill itself. Here's the sample of what a budget worksheet would look like. Now, the budget worksheet is actually longer than the budget bill document itself. It has a lot more details in there. And the way it is presented in 2025 is probably not all that intuitive when you look at it. So I've tried to highlight some of the components of a budget worksheet that you might immediately recognize and find familiar or valuable. Method of funding, the amount of the appropriation, reading the details to understand how much of that appropriation was actually requested, how much was actually approved. You could take this worksheet and you could relate it back to the budget bill as a component of the larger appropriation that's reflected in the budget bill. So let's talk a little bit to conclude about the budget execution process. And this will lead a little bit into what is the process of the budget at the University of Hawaiʻi. Well, here on this slide, I want to point out some bullets to refresh your memory about some of the issues and ideas that I've discussed about earlier. That the legislative appropriations are done on a biennium basis, so a 2-year budget, following the year of the last election is the biennium budget. So elections are typically held in the even number years. The fiscal year will start the July 1st following that in the odd number years. In the intermediary time, the legislature will construct a biennium budget for the next 2 fiscal years. And then in the year after that, the legislature will take on augmenting or supplementing the second year worth of funding, and that's the supplemental budget. Please keep in mind that whatever the legislature may approve or authorize in the budget bill is still subject to execution by the executive branch. It is a separation of powers issue. So just because the legislature appropriates it does not mean that the executive branch needs to expend it. Similarly, just because the executive branch requests it of the legislature does not mean the legislature needs to authorize it. So there is what's called a release. For state departments, release means whatever is appropriated, it is still at the discretion and the authority of the governor via the state budget and finance director to determine how much of that appropriation is actually going to be made available to any department or any program ID in the budget. That is called release. And for the University of Hawaiʻi, this typically can also include, well, when is the university going to get the funds? Quarterly, in quarterly increments, or monthly, in monthly increments, or semi-annual, or are we just going to get a lump sum? It changes from year to year. And as a former state budget and finance director, I will tell you that decisions about release from the state budget and finance director are governed by a number of factors and calculus formulas and assumptions. It has to do with the incoming state tax revenue levels, the progress of that. What are the departmental needs? How much cash is available in the state treasury? There are a number of factors. So it is not always assumed that the university is going to get the entire appropriation on July 1st at the start of the fiscal year. I would say that never happens. The other thing to keep in mind is that it is usual, and I've done it myself when I was State Budget and Finance Director. It is usual that the state, the governor, the BNF director will not release the entire appropriation even over the entire year. So in 2025, for the last 2 fiscal years, the Budget and Finance Director has restricted a portion of departmental appropriations to the tune of about 5 to 10% of the total appropriation has been restricted from departments, including the University of Hawaiʻi. So if our appropriation was, let's say, $1 billion, which it wasn't, but $1 billion in general funds, the BNF director has the authority and has restricted as much as 5 to 10%. So the amount that the university actually could get or would get is something on the order of more like $950 million if we were appropriated $1 billion in general funds. These are all governed by budget and finance policies issued by the state. The University of Hawaiʻi, although we are an autonomous agency or considered a semi-autonomous agency governed by a separate board or board of regents, we are still a state department and we are still required to adhere to executive branch policies and budget execution requirements. So your fiscal officer, your chief financial officer for the university works with and is governed by the state budget and finance director and its policies about how to deploy and execute on the budget. The State Department of Budget and Finance is also involved with the university when the university issues revenue bonds. Even though those are not bonds or debt of the state of Hawaii, we still have to include and get permission and processes approved through State Department of Budget and Finance. That is an example of the university, although we are autonomous, we are still a state department and still part of the executive branch operations. Now, the last slide here is related to the execution process after release of those funds from state budget and finance. The appropriation release is to the program IDs as appropriated. So, as I mentioned earlier, the appropriations to the University of Hawaiʻi go to the campus level of funding. UH Manoa or UH Hilo, the community college as a system, UH West Oahu. That is what state budget and finance releases on, that total appropriation amount. Decisions about how that amount is actually allocated or dispersed to programs and operations below the campus are decisions of your campus chancellor, your finance officer for that campus, your chief financial officer. That is within the authority of the University of Hawaiʻi. So we still control a lot in terms of deciding and determining how much are we funding each of our programs and where can we allocate funds based on the total amount of appropriations. Each campus may have different methodologies to do that. Larger campuses, say the University of Hawaii at Manoa, have a pretty complex allocation formula. And smaller campuses may not need for such complexity, but it is still within the authority of each chancellor and finance officer to determine how best to deploy funds to support all their downstream programs. So this concludes that portion related to the operating budget and the operating budget appropriation. If you've made it this far for this part of the series, I commend you again. And if you haven't watched the first part of the series to give you the basic primer, I would remind you to do so and come back if you need more information. The next series actually gets into a little bit more around the budget. And I welcome you to check out for that link if you have the courage and the attention and the energy to keep going. Until then, I'll look for you on the next presentation or series when you decide you need to learn more. Thank you.